Thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks for being there and for sticking around till the latter part of the day. I'm going to move pretty quickly to get through this in the time that's been allotted to me. A couple of quick acknowledgements though. I'm going to be presenting a few different research outcomes, and I just want to make it clear that all of these projects and all of the results that I'll be presenting are the result of some really great collaborations with a bunch of excellent humans, and there are some of them. And also I've been lucky enough to get some funding along the way that supported some of this work. I'm going to rush through the first couple of slides just to make sure that I have time to get to the important stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about crime and networks and why I would argue a network perspective or a network lens is useful in criminology. I'm going to talk briefly about theory, not long, because people will go to sleep, but it's important for reasons I'll outline shortly. And then I'll get to the grunt part of the presentation, which is to talk about some of the applications of social network analysis and network thinking in the space of criminology, and in particular around terrorism and organised crime, which is what I've spent the last 10 or so years researching. So let me start with why we should be interested in networks in the crime space. And fundamentally, I would argue that crime is a social problem, right? People rob and steal from other people. Violence and homicide occurs primarily between friends and acquaintances. Domestic violence occurs within close contexts of familial environments. And outside of age and gender, one of the most robust predictors we have of crime is the number of criminal peers that one hangs around, so peer influence. Andrew Papachristos wrote a brilliant and seminal article back in 2011, in which he said that criminology theory oozes with network imagery and jargon, and it's absolutely true. So I won't bore you with the details of some of these theories, but social influence theories, opportunity theories, routine activities theory, which talks about the relationships between offenders and victims and those who are tasked with preventing crime. It looks at the interactions of those individuals. Social bonding theories and social cohesion and control. Even though these theories were not built around networks, the people who founded these theories didn't have networks on their mind, but all of these theories really sing networks. The graph on the right-hand side, very briefly, is a graph of the references to networks, references to network analysis in the top journals in sociology, public health, and in criminology. And what this graph shows is, firstly, sociology's been all over it for a long time. We know that. The networks and social network theory, social network analysis grew out of sociology as well as other disciplines. Public health realized the benefit of network thinking back in the late 90s at the latest, particularly around epidemiology, spread of, say, pandemics, and policy responses. But criminology was really slow to the uptake on networks. It really wasn't until the early years of the 2000s that criminologists really started to get on the network bandwagon. And there's a small little sort of uptick in the early part of the 2000s there in that graph. I'll have a bit more to say about that right at the end of the talk. It's, as many of you would know, it's not possible to separate network data from network theory. And although there's no kind of coherent overarching network theory, there are a set of assumptions and concepts and principles within and outside of criminology that can guide theory development. And one of the frameworks that we've found most useful for much of our work is the network capital framework, which, again, briefly, describes network capital as being at the aggregate of human capital, so the skills, the knowledge and resources that individual actors possess within a network, and then social capital being the kind of social ties, the connectivity that individuals have, brokerage capacity of individuals in a network. And this has really guided much of our work in the criminology space and the organised crime and terrorism space, which I'll flesh out a little bit more as I go through the talk. So now really getting to kind of the applications part of this talk, I'm going to talk about I might just go back here briefly. I'm going to talk about network structure, and then I'm going to talk about identifying key actors, a bit about multiplexity, very briefly about network dynamics, and then I'm going to talk at the end about interventions for dismantling networks, and this is going to make up the sort of main part of the talk. So the first thing I want to talk about is how networks have assisted with our understanding of terrorism and terrorist networks. And much of the work on terrorism, much of the work in the social sciences is on case studies of particular actors, case studies of particular cells or groups who have engaged in particular attacks. What some of our work demonstrated, and it's on the screen now, is that what is also interesting from a network perspective is that these seemingly disconnected cells or groups are actually connected asynchronously across time, but they're connected in a way that was not understood before we did this research project. So each of these cells, there's sort of 4 groups that you can see clustered in this map, was studied on its own. But what we demonstrated is that there were connections over time, which allows for the flows of ideology, of tactics, of strategy across time. And of course, then we were also able to identify cut points in the graph that were of relevance to, or would be of relevance to, law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies whose job it is to collect information on these individuals and then to determine how best to intervene. Our work also had something to say about lone actors or lone wolves. These actors have been a sort of a contentious concept, both politically, but also within criminology. And the idea has been that these individuals are loners. They act alone, they radicalize alone. But what our research showed is that these are 3 individuals who were described both in official documents and in the media as being lone actors. But what a network perspective demonstrates is that these are far from lone actors. They're not radicalizing alone. They're radicalizing within the context of this wider network. Sometimes they're at the fringe of the network, but they're still part of the network and influenced by others, and they radicalize within this wider context. You'll start to get a sense of how quickly we're going to move through this. So now I'm shifting to an organized crime network, a drug trafficking network. This is a methamphetamine network that was producing and trafficking methamphetamine in the 1990s. Very briefly, you can see that there are connections between actors here, but that we've also allocated each actor a particular role. Because again, from a law enforcement perspective, law enforcement are resource constrained, right? They can't collect intelligence necessarily on every single actor. They can't arrest and go after every single actor. They need to make some decisions. And networks can help with making some of these decisions. So individuals can be key in a network because they're well connected, like this individual, a hub in the network. The removal is likely to lead to some fragmentation. Or individuals can be key because they're high on human capital, right? But this particular individual here, not particularly well connected, wouldn't stand out to law enforcement as being someone who looks key just based on ties. But this individual had particular skills. He could produce methamphetamine from precursor chemicals. So someone who is really key in the network and whose removal, he would be very difficult to replace if he was removed from the network. So these, again, are useful tools for law enforcement. Once we conducted that study, we wanted to dig in a little bit to the nuance of this idea of human capital beyond just allocating actors to roles. We wanted to look in a bit more detail at what we could find out about this idea of human capital. So we broke down the sequence of the chain of activities and resources that were required for the production of meth and trafficking of methamphetamine. And we determined there was this primary set of resources or attributes that was required. And then we were able to determine, based on the data that we had, which actors had access to which resources. Some actors had access to multiple different types of resources, some only one. And then what we did was we constructed a way of illustrating this using a cube in 3 dimensions. So we combine degree centrality, betweenness centrality, and what we call weight. And the weight is the number of resources of these attributes that they had access to. So it's a way of trying to identify key actors in an organised crime network beyond the usual degree and betweenness. So each actor in the network has a position within this 3-dimensional cube that represents their importance to the network. So just as an example, if we just looked at, let's say, law enforcement or intelligence agencies look at the top 10 actors by degree or betweenness, this is the list that we would have. But when we incorporate this multi-dimensional method of determining who is key, and if there are questions about this, I can expand on this perhaps during question time. When we combine these different data points, what we find in the yellow, indicated by the yellow rows, are a number of actors who don't show up just based on social network metrics, but when you combine human resource factors, then we have all this additional number of actors who appear to be key and important. We've also looked at network multiplexity, and again, primarily focused on what are the implications here for law enforcement and for dismantling these networks. So this is a methamphetamine trafficking network. The different colours of the ties represent the transfer, the exchange of different types of resources. That's what it looks like in its aggregate. But then we can also take sort of slices of each of those different sub-networks, if you like. The drug network, where we're just looking at the transfer, the exchange of drugs, the money network, and the precursor chemical network. Precursor chemicals are an important resource in producing this drug methamphetamine. And just very briefly, structurally, these 3 subgraphs are quite different. So the drug network, it looks as though perhaps there were 2 different groups trafficking methamphetamine, perhaps operating somewhat separately, but they're obviously exchanging money, and they're definitely exchanging precursor chemicals. So that's an interesting finding in and of itself. But beyond that, when we look at this idea of who are the key actors, what we're doing here is we are using a scatter plot to look at the sort of variability that each actor has on degree and betweenness. So actors who are in that top right quadrant are actors who are high on degree, high on betweenness. They're pretty obvious, right? They're the ones that are most visible. In most networks, if you're high on degree, you might have more influence and more power in a network. And that's probably true in a criminal network, in an illicit network, but what also you are is very visible to law enforcement and therefore somewhat vulnerable. So there's an argument that the most strategic position to take if you're part of an illicit network is to be low on degree, high on brokerage. So you get all of the benefits that come with being a broker without the vulnerability that comes with being well connected. But what we find in the full network, when we're looking at the aggregate network, we don't see anybody in that lower right quadrant, that sort of what we might call an ideal broker. But interestingly, when we just look at the drug network, just the exchange of drugs, or the money network, just the exchange of money, suddenly we find these individuals who don't show up as being important based on looking at the network as a whole. But when we slice the network up, we find that there are these actors who suddenly appear to be very important, and they're flying low on the radar, right? So they're being really strategic. All right, another change of pace. I want to talk a little bit about social dynamics. So as many of you would know, that the study of social dynamics has been somewhat of a holy grail in the network space, but even more so in the illicit network space. And that's primarily due to how difficult it is to get good data. And in this case, we need data over time. We were able to find such data, and we started by deriving some hypotheses about what we might expect in an illicit network. So the first one is kind of an obvious one. Maybe there's preferential attachment going on. We know it happens in networks, social networks more broadly. And Rob talked about this earlier on in his talk, where individuals joining a network tend to attach to actors who are already well connected. So that's the first one. The second one, and this draws particularly on the illicit network theory, is perhaps people in an illicit network prefer to be in a brokerage role, or perhaps they prefer to be at arm's length from other actors, so separated by another actor for security reasons. Triadic closure might be something we see in illicit networks. And the reasoning here is that in illicit networks, surprise, surprise, it's difficult to ensure trust. How do you trust another individual who has a history of ripping people off and being a criminal? Well, maybe triadic closure has a place in trust. In other words, if you're actor A here in this little hypothetical diagram, you can observe how B and C interact with each other. So perhaps triadic closure helps to facilitate trust in illicit networks. And then finally, because of the way that methamphetamine trafficking happens and the sequence of activities that need to be achieved to conduct this operation, maybe actors are more likely to connect with other actors who do a different role to them, right? It's a bit like a supply chain idea. This is the network over time. You'll see that there's some growth. There's other things I could talk about here, but I won't just yet. And if there are questions, I can go to that. If you look at just the final one at T4, time 4, it looks like there are hubs here. And I think it would be reasonable to hypothesize that preferential attachment is driving this kind of structure. But let's have a look at the results. There's a lot of results here. Don't worry. I'm just going to talk through a few major ones. So in terms of role match towards the bottom there, what we found is indeed actors are more likely to attach to connect to actors who play a different role to them rather than the same role, which makes sense in terms of the activities that need to be achieved. Triadic closure is significant in all of the models that we looked at. So individuals are more likely to attach in triads, as with distance too. So they're likely to attach in ways that facilitate brokerage and that idea of separation and increased security, buffering type interactions. The most interesting finding is that we didn't find any evidence for preferential attachment. So the clustering that we're finding in illicit networks appears to be driven by this preference for triadic closure and brokerage, this distance to idea. All right, the final part of my talk is about dismantling illicit networks. And just some very brief background, because I know many of you will understand this much better than I do, but as we know, scale-free networks, and again, I think Rob talked about this too in his talk earlier, are characterized by these hubs, high-degree hubs in the network. And what we know is that the removal of these hubs can lead to pretty rapid network fragmentation. And we're applying this idea to illicit networks. So we conducted some simulations of different law enforcement interventions that were driven by a network perspective. So we looked at cut set targeting. So cut set is a node or a group of nodes whose removal leads to the separation of a network, fragmentation, splicing off of different components. That was the first type of intervention that we looked at. Targeting by degree, so targeting the highest degree actors and working your way down. Targeting actors by betweenness. Targeting actors who are high on human resources, so it's human capital. So in this case, we targeted those actors who are involved in the exchange of money through the network. And then random targeting as a bit of a comparison. We haven't included random targeting on these output graphs because it's so bad and we wanted to try and keep the scale reasonable. So just take my word for it that random targeting was no better than chance. These two graphs are ways of measuring fragmentation. So the top left is the maximal component size. Bottom right is the number of components in the network. What we found overall is that targeting the network based on targeting brokers in the network, targeting high betweenness actors was the most effective at fragmenting the network. Next was targeting money, so targeting human capital, then targeting by degree. A little bit about our future plans for the Flinders Illicit Networks lab that I run here at Flinders Uni. 2 more slides to go, so I'm going to finish on time. We're looking at a current project on the intersections between terrorism and organised crime, and I would argue that the network perspective is a really neat and powerful way to have a look at this particular nexus. We're also looking at social dynamics in networks, particularly trust, which is a very fraught concept, particularly in the criminal network space. And another project looking at the structure of outlaw motorcycle gangs and how criminal collaboration happens in that context. We're keen to further develop theory. This is not an area where there's been a lot of good theory development, so theories around criminal collaboration and around trust. In terms of methods, we are keen to continue with our work in the sort of exponential random graph models and the stochastic actor models. But we're also interested in combining social network methods with ethnography. That has been a big part of criminology for a while, but these 2 methods haven't been used together. Part of the work that we do is engaging with law enforcement and security agencies, international collaborations, because these networks don't tend to follow national borders. And the impact of our work is really mainly around crime prevention, enhancing resilience, facilitating desistance from crime, and just reducing harms that tend to flow from crime. This is my last slide. I'm arguing that the network approach is absolutely consistent with criminological concepts and theories, that network methodologies, like the ones I've described today, can inform the study of crime and criminal justice. And what we found, particularly since 2010, when that original paper was published by Andrew Papachristos, is that new analytical approaches like ergoms and the availability of data, more availability of good data, have led to these advances in networked criminology. And that arrow, if we did that study now over the last 10 years, 2010 to 2020, we'd find that arrow would show a pretty strong increase in the papers in this space. We've just published a book. If anything I've said sounds interesting, you might be interested in taking a look at our book. Thank you very much.